The frost came before the light did that year, and it came with a smell of wet wool and cold iron and the ash of banked fires not yet stirred. Colthorpe woke slow in such weather. Hester Cole did not wait for it to wake. She was the kind of woman a village used and then forgot to thank. Not pretty enough to be remembered for her face, not poor enough to be pitied outright, not respectable enough by half to be invited anywhere she might have sat down and rested. She mended what broke. That was the whole of her trade, and very nearly the whole of her name in Colthorpe. A torn him, a split knuckle, a fevered child, a horse gone lame from a stone in the frog of its hoof. Her father had been a farrier before the cough took him, and before he died he had taught her to set a bone, the way another father might teach a daughter to dance, patiently, and because there was nothing else of value he had to leave her. She had 2 shawls when she was a girl. She had 1 now. The lane down to the mill was going to lose someone before the week was out. She had said as much to the miller himself, twice, about the ice that gathered on the plank bridge where the road dipped to cross the stream. Black ice, invisible until a foot was already on it. He had laughed the second time. She had not laughed either time. It was not the bridge that took her out before first light, though. It was a sound. A short one, more felt than heard, the particular flat crack of a body meeting hard ground. She found the boy in the ditch behind the Rendell stables, half in the frozen grass, his arm bent in a place an arm has no business bending. He could not have been more than 11. She knew him by sight, the stable boy they called Robbie, thin as a lath, the kind of orphan a great house keeps, because it is cheaper to feed him than to explain where he went. Nobody had come for him. That was the first thing she understood, kneeling in the wet grass with her skirt soaking through. He had been down long enough for the cold to reach him. Nobody had come. She did not go for help first. She went to work first, because help was a quarter-mile off and the boy was not. She talked to him the whole time, low and even, the way she talked to a horse that did not trust her yet. She told him her name. She told him he was not going to lose the arm. She did not know if that was true. She said it anyway, because a frightened child needs a fact to hold on to more than he needs an honest one, and she meant to make it true by main force if she had to. She had no proper splint. She used a fence lath and her apron strings, and when those were not enough, the shawl off her own back, torn in 2 and bound tight around the wood to keep it still against his skin. The wind came straight off the fen that morning and found her collarbone, and did not leave it again for an hour. She did not think about the shawl. She thought about the arm. It was full dark still, no moon, only the grey coming up slow behind the stable roofs, when a shape stepped out from the black mouth of the coach house and crossed the yard toward them without a lantern. She startled. She did not scream. She had learned young not to waste breath on sounds that did no work. He fell, she said, before the shape had even reached her, because there was no time for introductions, and she had judged, rightly, that whoever this was could either help or get out of the light. Off the loft ladder or the green colt, I can't tell which, and it doesn't matter now. I need another coat. I need it now. Not after you've asked me who I am. The man did not ask who she was. He took off his coat and put it around the boy without a word, and then he crouched on the boy's other side and held the lantern he had somehow produced steady over the arm so she could see what she was doing, and he did exactly what she told him to do, and no more and no less. He did not tell her his name either. There did not seem time for it, and afterward, when there was time, neither of them thought to ask, or perhaps both of them thought of it and did not. She would learn, much later, what it had cost a man like that to stay silent and simply hold a lantern for a mending woman in a stable yard before dawn. She did not know it then. She knew only that the boy's breathing had gone even, and that the stranger's hands did not shake once in the better part of an hour, and that when it was done he asked her nothing about payment, and she offered him nothing, because it had not once occurred to her that a night like that had a price attached. She did not know then that the man kneeling across from her in the frozen grass, coatless, unremarked, was the Duke of Rendal himself, 3 weeks new to the title and older in his own house than any of his servants yet knew him to be. She only knew that the boy was breathing steady, and that dawn was coming up grey and mean over the stable roof, and that her shawl was ruined, and that she did not, even now, particularly regret it. They carried Robbie in between them, she at the shoulders, the stranger at the feet, and it was the housekeeper who opened the kitchen door to them, a broad, dry-eyed woman with flour still on her wrists, who took one look and said, "Well," and then said nothing else useless, only moved. Mrs. Abbott had run the house through one duke's dying and another's coming, and she did not startle easily, but she looked twice at the coatless man carrying the boy's feet before she said, "Your Grace," quiet, not a question, and something in Hester's chest went very still and very cold, colder than the ditch had been. She looked at him properly for the first time then. Ordinary coat gone, plain waistcoat, mud to the knee, a face that had been unreadable in the dark and was not much more readable in the candlelight of the kitchen. He did not look at her when the housekeeper named him. He looked at the boy. "Send for the surgeon in town," he said. "Not the one on the estate roll. The good one. And find this woman a coat before she takes a chill worth more to fix than the boy's arm." He was gone from the kitchen before she had finished deciding whether to be angry at being spoken of as though she were a parcel needing wrapped, or grateful that he had thought of it at all. She did not curtsy. She did not think to. By the time she remembered that a duke had knelt across from her in a ditch, and she had ordered him about like a hired man, he had already gone, and there was nothing to do about it but sit down hard on the kitchen bench and let Mrs. Abbott put a blanket around her shoulders in place of the shawl she had lost. "He'll send for the boy's schooling, Mrs.," Abbott said, matter of fact, stirring something at the fire that did not need stirring. "You watch. He always does, and he never lets it be known whose doing it was." "Always," Hester said. "How always? He's 3 weeks a duke, longer than that, in ways that count," said Mrs. Abbott, and would not be drawn further, and Hester was too tired and too cold to press her. She walked home in the full grey light, with a borrowed blanket around her shoulders, and her ruined shawl in a bundle under her arm, and she did not think then that she had done anything worth remarking on. She had set a bone. She had done it before. She would have done it for anyone, stranger or duke or dog, and it would not have occurred to her to do less, because no one important was watching. Since it had not occurred to her that anyone was watching at all, she did not know then that the Duke of Rendal had stood in the black mouth of that coach-house for some minutes before he crossed the yard, watching her work in the dark before she knew he was there, and that what he had seen in those minutes, a woman on her knees in the frozen grass, giving up her own warmth to a child who could do nothing for her, and would very likely never think to thank her, properly, had settled into him like a nail driven true, the kind that does not work loose again. She did not know that he had already decided, before he ever picked up the lantern, that he meant to find out everything there was to know about her, quietly, and that he meant to do it in a way she would never catch him at. She only knew that her shoulder ached from the cold, and that the boy would keep his arm, and that she had a shawl to mend if it could be mended, and, if it could not, she would manage without one, as she had managed without a great many things. The days that followed were quiet in the way that precedes weather. Robbie was moved into the house proper, given a cot near the kitchen fire, and a full week of broth thick enough to stand a spoon in, and the surgeon from town came twice, without once mentioning a fee, which told Hester everything about who had settled it, and nothing about why he troubled to keep it secret. She was sent for on the third day, not by the Duke, but by Mrs. Abbott, with a note that said only that the house had need of a woman who could mend linen and set a bone without fainting at either task, and that the wage offered was fair, and that she might begin Monday if it suited. It suited. It suited more than she let herself say aloud, because a wage like that, steady and clean, was not a thing offered twice in a life like hers, and she had learned not to trust good fortune enough to thank it before it had proven itself. She took the position. She did not ask who had arranged it. She told herself it was Mrs. Abbott's doing, a housekeeper short-staffed and practical, and she believed it for exactly as long as it took her to notice that no one in that house ever mended so much as a torn cuff before it reached her hands, as though the mending were being manufactured to give her something to do. She noticed. She said nothing. A wage was a wage, and she was not in a position to question the arithmetic of her own good luck. The Duke she saw seldom, and always from a distance, across a hall, through a half-open door, once on the drive on a grey horse that did not suit his temperament, being too eager where he was not. He did not seem, from that distance, to be the same man who had held a lantern steady in a stable yard before dawn. That man had been quiet and plain and unremarkable, a coat and a pair of hands. This one moved through his own house like something built to carry weight, watchful, seldom smiling, spoken of by the maids in low voices that suggested either fear or something they had not yet found the courage to call by its right name. She did not connect the two men for the better part of a fortnight, and when she finally did, it was by accident, and it undid her more than she expected it to. She had gone up to the long gallery to collect a basket of linens left airing near the window, and the Duke was there, alone, standing before a portrait of a woman she did not recognise, his hands folded behind his back, in a way that put her in mind of nothing so much as a man standing at attention before a judgment he expected to lose. "You needn't stop," he said, without turning, before she had made a sound. "I heard the door. I only came for the linens, your Grace." She kept to the wall, the way a servant learns to keep to the wall, though she had not yet learned to think of herself fully as a servant, and something in her chest resisted the word even as her feet obeyed it. "The boy's arm is knitting well," he said. "The surgeon says clean. He says whoever splintered it in the dark, in a ditch, without proper linen, ought to be paid a surgeon's fee for the work rather than a mender's. I don't want a surgeon's fee." The words came out plainer than she meant them, and she did not soften them after, because softening a true thing had never struck her as an improvement on it. "I want my shawl back, if anyone's found where it went. It was the only one I had." Something crossed his face then, brief, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "It was cut for the splint. It couldn't be saved." "I know. I did the cutting." She looked at him properly then, The grave, unhandsome, watchful face, the dark eyes that gave away exactly as much as he chose to give and not a fraction more. And something in her, some small suspicious clerk that lived behind her ribs and kept accounts nobody had asked it to keep, added the height of him to the shape of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands, and arrived, all at once, unbidden, at the answer. "You were there," she said. "That morning, that was you." He did not deny it. He did not confirm it either, not at once. He only looked at her for a long moment, the kind of moment that goes on a beat too long to be comfortable, and is not shortened for the discomfort. "I was there," he said finally. "I didn't think it mattered who held the lantern. It matters that you let me order you about like a hired man, and never said a word. You needed a coat fetched, and a light held steady, not a title recited at you in a ditch." Something almost like humour moved at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "I judged the coat more useful." She did not laugh. She wanted to, and did not, because laughing at a duke in his own gallery seemed a further liberty on top of the one she had already taken, and she had used up her ration of forwardness for the day, simply by naming him. "Why didn't you say after?" she asked instead. "In the kitchen. Mrs. Abbott named you, and you let her, and you never once looked at me to see how I'd taken it." "Because I wanted to see what you'd do with the knowing," he said. "Whether you'd start curtsying at me and forget how to speak plainly, the way most people do the moment they learn what a title's worth. You haven't done it yet. I begin to think you won't. I might yet, Your Grace, if you keep watching for it." "Then I'll stop watching," he said, "and see if it happens anyway." And there was nothing in his face to tell her whether that was a jest or the truest thing he had said to her since the stable yard, and she left the gallery with her basket of linens, and no clearer notion of him than she had walked in with, only a great deal more curiosity than was safe or sensible in a woman paid to mend cuffs, and not to wonder about the man who owned them. She did not know then that he had gone to the trouble, 3 days before this meeting, of writing quietly to the parish where her father had died, and had settled, without her knowledge and without his name attached to the settlement, a debt of some years' standing that had hung over her father's grave like a weight she had not known was there to be lifted. She only knew, walking back down the gallery stair with the linens against her hip, that she had been looked at, properly, by a man who did not seem in the habit of looking properly at very much, and that she had liked it more than her good sense cared to admit. Lady Cordelia Prestwick arrived on a Tuesday with 4 trunks and a lady's maid, and an opinion on everything the house contained, delivered before she had so much as removed her gloves. She was the Duke's cousin on his father's side, handsome in the particular hard way of a woman who had never once doubted her own claim to a room, and she laughed, when she laughed, in 3 practised notes that fell exactly the same way every time, like a bell rung by someone who had grown bored of the tune. She found Hester on the second afternoon, in the small sitting-room off the East Hall, mending a torn flounce with her sleeves pushed back and her hands, red at the knuckle from years of cold water, moving quick and sure over the linen. "You," Lady Cordelia said, in the tone of a woman identifying a stain on a carpet. "The mending woman. I'd heard my cousin kept you on." "Yes, my lady." Hester did not stop her needle. "You might at least look up when you're dressed." "I might, my lady, but the thread will pucker if I lose the tension, and I thought you'd rather have the flounce mended right than have my full attention and a crooked him." The bell laugh, 3 notes, precise, how wonderfully practical. Tell me, does one learn that sort of answer? Or is it simply bred in with the coarser sort of hands? Hester set another stitch. I couldn't say, my lady. I've never had the coarser sort of hands to compare against the finer, only the one pair I was given, and they've kept me fed this 10 years, which is more than I could say for looking pretty at a wall. Careful, Lady Cordelia said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. My cousin has a soft spot for strays. It won't survive an inspection, whatever it is you imagine it to be. A duke marries where his name requires him to marry. He does not marry his mending woman, however cleverly she turns a phrase in his sitting rooms. I've never imagined anything of the kind, my lady. That, at least, was entirely true, and she said it steadily, because a true thing does not need to be said loudly to be said well. See that you keep imagining nothing, Lady Cordelia said, and left the room in a rustle of good silk, and Hester finished the flounce with hands that did not shake, though something under her ribs had gone tight and small, and stayed that way for the rest of the afternoon. She did not repeat the exchange to Mrs. Abbot, though the housekeeper found her out within the hour, the way Mrs. Abbot found most things out within the hour, and only said, setting a cup of tea at Hester's elbow without being asked, that one's tongue has put more than one good woman out the door before her month was up. Don't give her the satisfaction of watching you flinch. She feeds on it same as a fire feeds on green wood, slow, but it feeds all the same. I didn't flinch, Hester said. No, said Mrs. Abbot, looking at her carefully over the rim of her own cup. I noticed you didn't. He'll have noticed too, I shouldn't wonder, wherever he was standing. Hester did not ask what she meant by that, because she had a suspicion, uncomfortable and entirely unconfirmed, that the Duke had been a great deal nearer that doorway than either of them let on, and she was not yet ready to know for certain. She found out 3 weeks later, from Robbie of all people, who was mending faster than any surgeon had promised, and had taken to following her about the kitchen garden with the devotion of a boy who has decided a person saved his arm, and therefore owns some permanent claim on his company. He pays for the vicar's school, Robbie said, apropos of nothing. Turning over a stone with his good hand to look for beetles, old Tom Whitfield's boy goes free. And the widow Marsh got a new roof put on in the night, near enough, nobody ever saw who sent the men. Who told you that? Nobody told me. I listen. He said it without a trace of shame, the way children say true things adults have decided are secrets. He does it all the time. Mrs. Abbot says he'd skin the man who let his name get attached to it. Says it's the only vanity he hasn't got, not wanting credit for the good he does. Hester did not answer that at once. She thought of her father's debt quietly settled, that she had assumed was some clerical mercy of the parish, and had never once thought to trace further, and something cold and clear moved through her, not quite recognition, not yet, but close enough to its shadow that she found she could not finish weeding the row she had started. She did not know then how many threads led back to the same quiet hand. She only knew that the accounting clerk behind her ribs had begun, without her permission, to keep a very different ledger than the one it had kept before. The public trial of it came at midsummer, at a supper the Duke gave for the neighbouring families, the kind of evening Hester would ordinarily have spent below stairs with the other mending women, invisible and glad to be so. She was not below stairs that night. She had been asked plainly by the Duke himself to sit at the lower end of the table, because Robbie had taken a fright at the crowd, and would settle for no one but her. And a Duke's household bends its seating to a Duke's convenience, whatever the neighbours think of it. The neighbours thought a great deal of it, and said little of that thought aloud until the syllabub was cleared, at which point Lady Cordelia, 3 glasses of good wine into an evening that had not improved her temper, turned the full weight of the table's attention onto the far end, with a question pitched to Carrie. "Tell me, Miss Cole, however did you come to sit at my cousin's table? I confess I've lost the thread. Was it your needlework, or some other accomplishment I haven't yet had the pleasure of hearing catalogued?" The table went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses blood in the water and does not intend to look away from it. Hester set down her spoon. She did not look at the Duke, though she felt him go very still at the head of the table, the stillness of a man deciding whether to intervene and weighing what it would cost her if he did. "I sit here because the boy beside me was frightened of the noise, my lady, and asked for me, and his Grace was kind enough to think a child's comfort worth more tonight than the order of the seating chart." She kept her voice level, the same voice she used to talk a spooked horse down from its fright. "As for my accomplishments, I set his arm the night he fell, and I mend what wants mending in this house, and if that's a poor enough qualification for a chair at the far end of a long table, I'm content to have it thought poor. I never asked for the chair. I'll give it up gladly the moment the boy no longer wants my hand." "How very selfless," Lady Cordelia said, the bell laugh, 3 notes thinner than usual. "One begins to suspect the selflessness is itself the performance, Miss Cole. It's remarkably convenient, is it not, to be so very good, so very publicly, at exactly the moment it might be noticed by exactly the right eyes. I didn't know I was being watched the night I set his arm, my lady. There was no one there to notice but the dark and the cold, and I'll own I never once thought to perform for either." She said it plainly, not sharply, and it landed harder for the lack of an edge. If kindness only counts when it's unseen, then I suppose I've been counted a great many times over these 10 years, and never once knew the tally was being kept. The Duke's hand at the head of the table had gone still around the stem of his glass. He did not speak. He did not need to. Something in his face, grave and unreadable to everyone else at that table, had settled into an expression Hester would not understand the full weight of until much later, and Lady Cordelia, whatever else her failings, was not stupid, and she read that expression correctly enough to let the subject drop, the bell laugh fading into silence for the rest of the evening. Hester did not weep that night, in front of the table or after it, walking back to her small room off the kitchen passage, with her face composed and her hands, when she finally looked at them, only a little unsteady. She had learned long ago not to cry where it showed. She lay awake instead, turning the exchange over the way she turned a hem, looking for where the stitch had gone wrong, and found, to her own surprise, that it had not gone wrong at all. She had said what was true. She had meant every word of it, that the Duke's face had done something complicated and unreadable, while she said it was a fact she set carefully aside, because she did not yet trust herself to know what to do with it. She did not know then that Lady Cordelia had left the supper with a plan already forming, one that had nothing to do with fair fighting, and everything to do with the fact that a woman who cannot be shamed in public must instead be misled in private, and that the ground for that misleading was already being prepared before the syllabub had properly cleared. The summer went its slow way after that, and something in the house shifted with it, quiet as a tide going out. The Duke found reasons, small and unremarkable on their own, to be in whatever room Hester was mending in. He asked after Robbie's arm long past the point the boy needed asking after. He brought her, once, a length of good linen thread from town, saying only that the cheap kind she'd been using knotted too easily, and left before she could thank him properly, which she had begun to notice was a habit of his, leaving before thanks could land. She found she watched for him the way she had once watched the sky for weather, not with dread, but with the automatic attention of a woman who has learned to read the signs of a thing before it arrives. She did not call it what it was. She had no practice calling such things by their names. She had spent 10 years training herself out of wanting things she could not have, and the training held. Mostly, except in the quiet hour before sleep, when it held rather less well than she would have liked. It was Mrs. Abbott who first said the word aloud, or near enough to it, one evening in late summer when the two of them sat over the mending basket after the house had gone quiet. "You're fond of him, Mrs., Abbott said, not looking up from her own needle, as though the observation cost her nothing at all. "I respect him," Hester said. "There's a difference." "There is, Mrs., Abbott agreed placidly. "I've watched you not make it for 3 weeks running." Hester did not answer that. There was nothing true to say that would not also be a confession, and she was not ready, that evening, to confess anything, not even to herself, in the privacy of her own head, let alone across a mending basket to a housekeeper who missed nothing and forgot less. "He had a betrothed once," Mrs. Abbott said, after a while, gently, the way one lays down a card face up, so another player can decide what to do with the knowledge. "Before the old Duke died. A pretty thing, all soft manners in company, and none at all below stairs. She turned a housemaid off without a character over a broken vase the girl never touched, wept about it prettily to him after, and he broke it off within the month and never spoke of her again that I heard, except once, to say he'd rather know a woman's true temper before he wed her than after. Why are you telling me this? Because you'll want to understand him, one day soon, and it saves time to understand the shape of the wound before you're asked to stand near it." "Mrs." Abbott bit off her thread. "He watches how a person treats those who can do nothing for them. It's the only test he trusts any more. You passed it in a ditch before you ever knew you were sitting an examination. Hester said nothing to that either, but she carried it to bed with her, and turned it over in the dark for a long while before sleep took her, and if her hands were not quite steady setting down the candle, there was no one awake to see it, and she told herself in the morning that it had not happened at all. The letter came on a Thursday in early autumn, carried up from the village by the miller's boy, and it did not come to Hester at all, though it changed everything about her that week regardless. It came to Mrs. Abbott from Lady Cordelia, announcing that she would return to Rendell Court within the fortnight to see to the arrangements for a family wedding to be held in the estate chapel, and that the household was to prepare accordingly, and that His Grace would want everything done properly, given the importance of the match to the family's standing. Mrs. Abbott read it twice before she said anything, and what she said was careful in a way Hester had learned to distrust. "A wedding," Hester repeated. "Whose, the letter doesn't say. Precisely, Mrs." Abbott folded it along its old crease. "Slow, only that it's a Prestwick match, and that His Grace's presence and consent are both required, and that the chapel's to be readied. That could mean her brother, Mr. Frederick." Hester said it too quickly, and heard herself say it too quickly, and did not like what the speed of it told her about the state of her own hopes. "It could, Mrs." Abbott agreed, and did not say more, and the not saying more sat between them for the rest of that day like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending its rings out slow in every direction. Lady Cordelia arrived 4 days later, and made certain, with a skill Hester had to admire even as it undid her, that no one in the house ever spoke the bride's or groom's name in Hester's hearing, that every mention of the coming wedding referred only to His Grace's obligations, His Grace's guests, His Grace's chapel, His Grace's day. until the shape of the thing Hester was not permitted to ask about outright had built itself, brick by careful brick, into a wall she could not see past and dared not climb. She asked the Duke directly only once. She found him in the estate office, going over the chapel accounts with a face she could not read, and she stood in the doorway with a bundle of altered linens in her arms and asked, as plainly as she had asked anything in her life, whether it was his own wedding the house was being readied for. He looked up at her. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and troubled, gone, before she could name it. Hester, it was the first time he had used her Christian name in the house's hearing, and it landed strangely. Half a gift, and half a wound, because he said nothing after it. He seemed, for one unbearable moment, on the edge of saying a great deal, and then Lady Cordelia's voice came from the passage behind her, bright and carrying, asking after the chapel flowers, and the moment closed like a door drawn shut by a draught. "I have business to see to before Saturday," he said instead, low, and it was not an answer, and she understood it as an answer regardless. The way a person understands the silence after a question they already suspect they know the shape of. She did not know then that Lady Cordelia had told him, that very morning, in the strictest confidence, that Hester had already been informed of the truth of the match, and wished only to be spared the awkwardness of discussing it. She did not know that the lie had been constructed with exactly enough care to explain his own silence back to him, and that a man who trusted his cousin's honesty rather more than her character deserved had, for one costly week, believed it. She only knew that he had not answered her, and that the not answering told her everything she had feared it might, and she set the linens down on his desk and left the office with her spine very straight, and her hands, for the first time in a long while, not quite steady at all. She resigned her position that same evening in a note left for Mrs. Abbott, saying only that she was grateful for the work and would trouble the house no further after the wedding was seen to, since her own affairs called her elsewhere. It was not true. She had no other affairs. She wrote it anyway, because a lie of that size felt, that night, considerably kinder to carry than the truth. Mrs. Abbott found the note before morning and did not accept it, not outright only said, over breakfast, with the particular briskness of a woman who has decided a thing will be dealt with later and not before, that the bride's gown wanted a hand steadier than the London modiste had sent down with it, a seam gone wrong at the shoulder, and that Hester, whatever her plans, would surely see it finished properly before she thought of going anywhere. It was not quite an order. It was not quite a request either. Hester, who had never in her life left a piece of work half sewn out of spite, took up the gown. She worked on it in the small sitting-room through 2 long days, alone, her needle moving fast and sure over silk finer than anything she had touched before, and she did not let herself think, while she worked, about whose shoulders the fabric would sit on, or whose hand would draw the glove off a bride's finger that Saturday night, or what a duke's wedding night looked like from the outside, in a mending woman's small cold room off the kitchen passage. She finished the gown on the Friday evening. It fit the shoulder like water finding its own level. She did not know, folding it away for the morning, that the shoulders it was cut for belonged to Miss Augusta Kell, and not to any Prestwick claim on the Duke of Rendal at all. The chapel was full by 9, and Hester stood at the very back of it near the door, where the mending women and the upper servants stood when a great house permitted them to witness a family's business at all. She had been asked plainly by Mrs. Abbott to be present in case the gown wanted a stitch at the last moment, and she had agreed, because refusing would have required an explanation she was not prepared to give. and because some stubborn, punishing part of her wanted to see it through to the end, the way a person presses a bruise to be certain of how much it still hurts. The chapel smelled of beeswax and white flowers and old stone, cold even in the early sun coming through the east window. She stood very straight. She did not look at the front of the aisle longer than courtesy required. She watched the bride come up on her father's arm in the gown Hester's own hands had finished, and she watched the groom turn to receive her. And it took the better part of a full minute, standing there at the back with her hands folded tight in front of her, for the shape of the man at the altar to resolve itself into a stranger's face, sandy-haired, slighter through the shoulder, nothing at all like the grave dark head she had been bracing herself, for 4 days, to see standing there instead. Frederick Prestwick, not the Duke. She did not gasp. She did not let her face move at all, though something in her chest gave way all at once, relief and fury arriving together and indistinguishable from one another, and she stood through the whole of the service with her spine straight and her hands folded and her face perfectly, punishingly composed, because there was no one in that chapel she trusted enough to let see what was happening behind. It, and because 4 days of believing herself already lost had taught her a discipline she did not know, until that morning she had fully mastered. She kept her face through the vows, she kept it through the register, through the ringing of the small chapel bell, through the receiving line she was not part of and stood well back from, through Lady Cordelia's bright, satisfied smile as she moved among the guests like a woman who has arranged a great deal more than a wedding. She did not know then that Lady Cordelia had arranged precisely this, the vagueness, the silence, the 4 days of dread, not because she believed Hester and the Duke had any true understanding between them, but because she suspected, correctly, that they might, and had judged it cheaper to frighten Hester into leaving on her own than to fight a battle whose outcome she could not be certain of winning outright. She only knew, walking out of that chapel into a bright cold morning with her face still perfectly composed, that she had nearly given notice, nearly packed her one trunk, nearly walked out of Rendell Court forever over a wedding that had never once been the Duke's to begin with, and that the composure she was so proud of, the steady hands, the level voice, had cost her more that morning than any single day's grief in 10 years of grief, and that she did not think she could keep it up very much longer. Mrs. Abbott found her in the passage an hour after the wedding breakfast had begun, and took one look at her face, composed as it was, and said nothing about weddings at all. "I've 2 tickets for the theatre in town tonight," she said instead, brisk, holding them out like a woman settling a debt rather than offering a gift. "Bought and paid and wasted if nobody uses them. I can't go. My knee won't sit through 3 acts on a hard bench. You'll go, and you'll wear the blue, and you'll not argue with me about it, because I've had quite enough of arguing for 1 week and I intend to have none of it from you. I don't want charity, Mrs. Abbott. It isn't charity. It's a woman with 2 tickets and no knee for sitting, and you happen to be standing in front of me. Take it as plain fact, not kindness, if the word sits easier that way." Mrs. Abbott pressed the tickets into her hand and closed her fingers over them, firm. "Go. See something that isn't this house for 1 evening. You've earned an evening that isn't this house." Hester did not have the strength by that point in the day to argue with a woman who had decided a thing, and some small worn-down part of her, the part that had held her face steady through an entire wedding, that was not even the wedding she had dreaded, wanted very badly to sit in the dark somewhere and simply stop holding it. She went, she wore the blue. She told herself, walking into the theatre alone, that she wanted nothing more than to watch a play by strangers and think about nobody at all. And she very nearly believed it, until the house lights went down, and she found herself alone in the small box Mrs. Abbott's tickets had bought her, the velvet curtain half drawn, the noise of the crowded pit falling away below her like water going under a bridge, and she understood all at once that she was, for the first time in 4 days, entirely and safely unwatched. She had thought the box empty behind her. She had checked, once on entering, out of the same old habit that made her check a room before she cried in it, a habit 10 years deep and never once broken, not for grief, not for shame, not for anything. The box behind hers had stood dark and curtained, and so far as she could tell in the low light, entirely unoccupied, and she had let that fact settle over her, like a held breath finally released. The play began. She did not follow a word of it. She sat very still in the dark, her hands folded in her lap the way they had been folded in the chapel that morning, and she thought of the sandy-haired stranger at the altar who was not the Duke, and of 4 days spent bracing for a grief that had never been hers to grieve, and of the note she had written and Mrs. Abbott had refused to accept, and of a man who had not answered her when she asked him plainly whether the wedding was his own, and who had let her go 4 days without an answer when a single sentence would have spared her every hour of it. She had told herself, walking into the theatre, that she was too tired for tears. She discovered, in the dark, that she had been wrong. She did not sob. She had never once in her adult life sobbed, and did not begin that night. It came instead the way a dam gives, not all at once, but in a long, low breaking, silent, her shoulders drawn tight, her hand pressed hard against her own mouth, as though she could hold the sound in even as she could not hold the water. And she let it come because there was no one. She was certain. No one at all in the whole dark theatre. To see a mending woman fall apart quietly in a borrowed blue dress over a wedding that had never even been the one she feared. She did not know then that the box behind hers was not empty at all, and had not been empty since some minutes before the curtain rose, and that the Duke of Rendell sat perfectly still in the dark on the other side of that thin velvet divide, having come to that theatre on that particular night for no reason he could have named to anyone who asked him. Only a restlessness that had driven him out of a house full of wedding guests he had no patience left for, and who had heard, through the gap where the curtain did not quite meet the wall, every silent, unwitnessed thing a woman does when she believes, with her whole worn-down heart, that no one of consequence is watching her at all. He did not move for a long while. He told himself, sitting in the dark with his own hands gone very still in his lap, that the honourable thing, the only decent thing, was to rise now, quietly, and leave her the privacy she believed she had, and for perhaps 3 full minutes he very nearly did exactly that. He did not do it. He sat instead with the sound of her carrying through the thin wall between them, and he understood. With a clarity that felt less like a discovery than like a debt finally called in, that he was hearing the truest thing she had ever shown him, truer than the ditch, truer than the gallery, truer than the long table where she had answered his cousin's cruelty, without once raising her voice. She had not known she was seen the night she saved a stable boy's arm. She did not know she was heard now. Both times the whole of her had been on display, unguarded, unperformed, and both times he had been. By some accident he had stopped believing in as accident, exactly close enough to witness it. He thought of the 4 days he had let pass in silence, believing his cousin's careful lie, and something in him, grave, and slow to anger, went cold with a fury that had nowhere useful to spend itself except on himself. He rose, at last, not quietly at all, and crossed the narrow passage between the two boxes, and drew back the curtain of hers without knocking. Because knocking, he judged, would have given her time to compose the face she had spent 4 days composing, and he did not want that face tonight. He wanted the one he had just heard. She turned at the sound, her hand still half raised to her own mouth, her eyes bright and unguarded in the low light, and for 1 full second neither of them said anything at all, the play going on unheeded below them. A swell of orchestra rising through the floor of the box like something felt rather than heard. "You," she said finally, low, and there was no curtsy in it, no station marker, nothing but the plain shock of a woman caught entirely without her armour. "You were there. The whole time. I was there." He did not sit. He stood in the doorway of the box as though he had not yet earned the right to come further in. "I ought to have left the moment I understood you thought yourself alone. I told myself so, twice, and I didn't do it." "Why not?" Her voice was not quite steady. She did not try to make it so, and something in him marked that, filed it away, the same way he had once filed away the steadiness of her hands over a broken arm in the cold. "Because I have spent 4 days believing something I should have questioned the first hour I heard it," he said, "and I would rather stand here and let you be angry at me for staying than go on another hour letting you believe I never cared enough to correct it." She stared at him. Below them the orchestra swelled and fell away again, and somewhere in the pit a woman laughed at something on the stage, and neither of them turned to look at any of it. "It wasn't your wedding," she said. "Not quite a question. It was never my wedding. My cousin let you believe otherwise, and I let my cousin's word stand unquestioned longer than I have any excuse for, because I trusted her honesty a great deal more than her character deserved, and that failure is mine to answer for, not hers alone." He said it plainly, without softening it, and she recognised, even through the wreck of her own composure, that he was not asking her to forgive him yet, only telling her the truth as flatly as she had once told a table full of gentry the truth about her own hands. You could have said 1 sentence. Her voice cracked on it, the first crack in 4 days, and she let it crack, because there was no longer any point in holding it steady, not with him standing there having already heard the whole of what she had been trying to hide. 1 sentence, in your office, when I asked you plainly. You said my name, and then you said nothing. I know. He did come closer then, slow, giving her every chance to tell him to stop, and she did not tell him to stop. I have no defence for the silence, except that I am not accustomed to explaining myself, and I let that habit cost you 4 days it should never have cost you, and I am sorry for it in a way I don't have better words for tonight than that. She looked at him for a long moment, her hand still pressed loosely against her mouth, as though it had forgotten it no longer needed to hold anything back. And something in her, the small suspicious clerk that had kept accounts behind her ribs for 10 years without asking permission, set down its ledger at last. Because the sum, when she finally let herself add it honestly, had never once come out against him. "You were in the coach-house that first morning," she said slowly, "before you ever crossed the yard. Mrs. Abbott as good as told me you watch to see what a person is when they think no one of rank can see them. Is that what tonight was?" Another examination. No, he said it fast enough and firm enough that she believed him before he explained himself further. Tonight I came for no reason I can give you that sounds like sense. I sat in a dark box because I did not want to be at a wedding breakfast full of people discussing a match I had no part in arranging. And I heard you before I ever meant to, and I stayed because leaving felt, God help me, like the worst cruelty of the two. He stopped, close enough now that she had to tip her face up to hold his eyes, and something in his own face had gone entirely unguarded, a thing she had not seen from him before, not in the gallery, not at the long table, not even in the stable yard in the dark. I did not come to see what you are when you believe no one is watching. I have already seen that, twice now, and both times it undid whatever careful distance I had meant to keep from you. I came tonight for no better reason than that I could not stay away from a house full of people discussing another man's wedding while you were somewhere in this town, unhappy, and I did not yet have the right to go and find out why. She said nothing to that for a long moment. Below them the play went on, forgotten, and the candle in the small wall sconce guttered once and steadied. And somewhere out past the velvet a rook, disturbed by the noise of the town, called once into the dark and fell silent. I am angry with you, she said finally, and it was true, and she let it be true without softening it, the same discipline she had always kept, turned now toward him instead of away. I sat through an entire wedding this morning, believing I had lost something I never had any right to hope for in the first place, and I did it because you let a silence stand where one honest sentence would have done. I don't forgive that, simply because you followed me into a theatre box to say pretty things about not being able to stay away. I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. He said it steadily, and something in the steadiness told her he meant it exactly as plainly as he said it. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, except to let me sit here, in this box, at whatever distance you judge safe, until the play is over, so that you are not alone in the dark a second longer than you choose to be. She looked at him for a long moment more. Then, without a word, she moved her skirts aside on the narrow bench, which was answer enough, and he sat, not close, careful of the distance, and neither of them watched another moment of the play, and neither of them spoke again, until the house lights came up, and the crowd below began its slow, noisy exit into the night. He walked her home himself, the two of them alone in a hired carriage through streets gone quiet, and he told her plainly, without ornament, everything he had not said in the estate office 4 days before. That the wedding had been his cousin's brother's, arranged for family reasons that had nothing to do with him beyond his required presence. That Lady Cordelia had told him, the very morning Hester came to his office, that Hester already understood the truth of the match and preferred not to discuss it. A lie constructed with just enough care to explain his own silence back to him, before he had cause to question it. That he had believed it for exactly as long as it took Mrs. Abbott that evening to mention in passing that Hester had left a resignation note on her desk, and that the sight of that note, more than any other single thing in his adult life, had frightened him into understanding what he stood to lose through nothing but his own poor habit of silence. I was raised to believe a title excuses a man from explaining himself, he said, as the carriage rattled slow over the dark road, and I have spent most of my life believing it without once testing whether it was true. You have never once let me get away with it, not in the gallery, not at that table with my cousin's tongue at its sharpest. You have always required the whole truth of me, plainly stated, and I find I would rather give it to you badly than withhold it well. That's a strange sort of courting speech, Your Grace. It isn't a courting speech. He looked at her steadily in the dim light of the carriage lamp. I have no intention of courting you tonight, or asking you for any answer tonight, or pressing you toward any decision. while you are still tired and still angry, and still, I think, not at all certain you should trust a single word out of my mouth. I only wanted you to have the truth, complete before you slept, so that whatever you decide about me from here forward, you decide it with every fact in your possession, and not one withheld." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark hedgerows slide past the carriage window. "And if I decide against you," she said finally, "with every fact in my possession, then I will have lost fairly, having told you everything, and I will not trouble you further, and you will keep your position in the house for as long as you want it, whatever you decide about me." He said it without flinching, and she understood, hearing it, that he meant every word, and that the offer cost him something considerable to make plainly and without hedging. "I would rather have your honest no than a yes given out of gratitude, or pity, or the plain fact that I am a duke, and you have been taught all your life that a duke's wish is a thing to be managed rather than answered freely. I want the truth from you the same way you have always demanded it from me. Nothing less will do, for either of us." She did not answer him that night. He did not ask her to. He left her at the kitchen door of Rendell Court with nothing more than a plain, quiet good night, and she went up to her small room off the passage and lay awake a long while, turning the whole of the evening over the way she turned a hem, looking, out of old habit, for where the stitch had gone wrong, and finding, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that it had not gone wrong anywhere at all. She gave him her answer 11 days later, in the same small sitting-room off the East Hall, where Lady Cordelia had once asked her, with a bell laugh and a cruel eye, how a mending woman had come to sit at a duke's table. Lady Cordelia was gone by then, sent off within the week to a distant aunt in the north with a letter from the Duke that Hester never read, and never asked to read, only heard of second-hand from Mrs. Abbot, who reported, with considerable satisfaction, that his Grace had made it plain his cousin would not be received at Rendell Court again, until she had learned to treat those beneath her with something other than contempt, and that the aunt in question kept a very cold house, and an even colder table, and that Lady Cordelia's letters home, when they came at all, had lost a good deal of their bell-like polish. Hester had spent the 11 days doing what she had always done with a thing too large to carry all at once. She mended. She sat with Robbie, whose arm had healed straight and true, and who had taken, since the theatre, to watching her with the particular solemn attention of a boy trying to work out a puzzle just beyond his years. She thought, at length and honestly, about a man who had let a silence cost her 4 days of needless grief, and about the same man's hands, steady over a lantern in the dark, and about a secret ledger of paid debts and quiet schooling and roofs mended in the night that she had traced, piece by piece, back to a single source, who had never once asked to be thanked for any of it. She found at the end of 11 days that the accounting came out the same way every time she added it, however hard she tried to find fault with the sum. He came to her in the sitting-room on a grey afternoon threatening rain, and he did not press her, and he did not ask, only stood in the doorway with his hat still in his hand, as though he had come straight from somewhere, and had not thought to set it down, and she looked up from her mending and set the needle aside herself, which was between the two of them. Answer enough that he understood before she had said a single word. "I would rather have your no, freely given," he said, quiet, "than a yes you felt you must give me. I told you that once already, and I meant it. I know you meant it." She stood, and crossed the small room to him, and took the hat gently out of his hand and set it on the table, because it seemed suddenly absurd for either of them to keep talking around a hat. That's rather why I'm not giving you a no." He went very still. "Hester, I set your bone in the dark before I knew your name," she said, "and I'd do it again tomorrow for a stranger, and think nothing of it, and I have spent 10 years believing that was the whole of what I had to give anyone, a pair of steady hands, and nothing softer underneath them. You're the first person who ever looked at that and thought there might be more to find, and went looking properly instead of taking the hands and walking away with them." She drew off one glove, slow, finger by finger, an old habit before mending, and set it on the table beside his hat, and held her bare hand out to him, plain, unadorned, red still at the knuckle from 10 years of cold water. "I want to be spoken to honestly for the whole of my life, not only when it's convenient. I want never to be lied to again, not kindly, not to spare me, not for any reason at all. And I want to keep the whole of myself, the mending and the plain speaking, and the woman who cried in a theatre box thinking no one saw her, not have any part of it smoothed away because it doesn't suit a duchess's drawing room." "You'll have all three," he said, and took her bare hand in both of his, careful, as though it were something that might yet decide to withdraw itself. "And you will never once have to ask me twice for the truth, whatever it costs either of us to say it." "Yes," she said. It was the only word she needed. He kissed her hand once, slow, his mouth against her knuckles where the cold water had marked them, and it was the whole of what either of them allowed that grey afternoon, and it was, for two people who had each spent a great deal of their lives learning to want less than they were given. Entirely enough. They were married in the estate chapel on a bright morning the following spring, quietly, with none of the fuss a duke's wedding might have commanded had the duke in question wanted fuss, which he did not, and which she wanted even less. Mrs. Abbott cried through the whole of the register, and denied it fiercely afterward to anyone who mentioned it. Robbie, grown a full inch and apprenticed by then to the estate's own bone-setter at his own insistence, stood at the back exactly where Hester had once stood at another wedding, and did not keep his composure nearly as well as she had, and nobody minded in the least. A year later, almost to the day, the fire in the small sitting-room off the east hall burned low and gold against an early dark, and Hester sat before it with her mending forgotten in her lap, and her husband came in from the cold with the particular quiet of a man who has walked the whole of his own land and found it, for once, entirely at peace. He crossed the room without a word and settled a shawl, new, soft, grey, as the one she had lost, over her shoulders from behind. And she reached up without turning, and found his hand, bare, and laced her fingers through his, and neither of them let go for a long while. The fire popping once, low, and somewhere out past the dark window, a rook called once, and fell silent, and the house around them held the particular stillness of a place where nothing more needed proving. Character, in the end, is only ever the sum of what a person does when they believe no one worth impressing is watching. And love, when it is real, is simply the moment someone worth trusting watches anyway, and stays.